Last summer, I decided to go on a camping trip with my friends Alex, Sarah, and Mike to Yellowstone National Park. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of our daily lives in Seattle and immerse ourselves in nature. We packed up Alex's SUV with all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and enough food to last us for a week. The drive from Seattle to Yellowstone took us about 14 hours, but we made it fun by taking turns at the wheel, singing along to our favorite road trip playlists, and stopping at quirky roadside attractions along the way. We arrived at Yellowstone in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky and casting a golden glow over the landscape. The park was bustling with activity, families and groups of friends all excited to start their adventures. We checked in at the visitor center, got our camping permits, and a map of the park. The ranger at the desk was super helpful, giving us tips on the best trails and warning us about bear safety. She recommended we camp near the Lamar River, known for its beautiful scenery and relative seclusion. Following her advice, we drove to the northeastern part of the park, the winding roads taking us through breathtaking vistas of rolling hills, dense forests, and open meadows. As we neared our destination, we spotted a herd of bison in the distance, their massive forms silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a magical moment that set the tone for what we hoped would be an unforgettable trip. We found a perfect spot to set up camp near the Lamar River, just as the ranger had suggested. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with the gentle sound of the river in the background. We quickly got to work setting up our tents, wanting to finish before it got dark. Mike and I tackled the bigger 4-person tent, while Sarah and Alex set up the smaller 2-person tent. We had a bit of a laugh struggling with the tent poles and pegs, but eventually we had our little campsite ready. As night fell, we gathered around our campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars above were incredible, more numerous and brighter than we'd ever seen in the city. We could even make out the Milky Way stretching across the sky. It was peaceful, with only the crackling of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl breaking the silence. We turned in for the night around 11 p.m., tired from the long drive and excited for the hiking we had planned for the next day. I shared the larger tent with Mike, while Sarah and Alex took the smaller one. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the hard ground beneath me, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the soft rushing of the river. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I woke up, but it must have been around midnight. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a rustling sound coming from just outside the tent. My first thought was that it might be a bear, remembering all the warnings we'd received about proper food storage. My heart started racing, and I lay there frozen, straining my ears to figure out what was going on. The rustling continued, and it didn't sound like an animal rummaging through our stuff. It was more deliberate, almost like footsteps. I nudged Mike awake, whispering to him about the noise. He listened for a moment, then suggested it was probably just Alex or Sarah going to the bathroom. Still uneasy, I decided to take a look. I slowly unzipped the tent flap, trying to make as little noise as possible. Peering out, my eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness. The campfire had long since died down to embers, casting a faint red glow. The moon was out, nearly full, providing just enough light to see by. That's when I saw it. A tall figure standing at the edge of our campsite, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was just standing there, completely still, facing our tents. It was too dark to make out any details, but something about the way it stood there, so motionless, sent a chill down my spine. Thinking it might be one of my friends, I called out softly, asking if everything was okay. The figure didn't move or respond. I called out again, a little louder this time, but still nothing. By this point, Mike had joined me at the tent opening, and I could hear Sarah and Alex stirring in their tent. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly as I fumbled with the switch. When I finally managed to turn it on and shine it towards the spot where the figure had been standing, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. Mike and I exchanged confused looks. We both climbed out of the tent, flashlights in hand, and began to search the area. Sarah and Alex joined us, rubbing sleep from their eyes and asking what was going on. We explained what we'd seen, or thought we'd seen, and continued to look around. That's when we noticed the footprints. There, in a patch of soft earth near where I'd seen the figure, were several large footprints. They were much bigger than any of ours, and the pattern didn't match the soles of our hiking boots. We followed the tracks to the edge of our campsite, where they seemed to disappear into the underbrush. We spent the next hour searching the area, calling out and shining our flashlights into the darkness. But we found no other signs of anyone or anything unusual. Eventually, we decided to head back to our tents, but none of us felt like sleeping anymore. We sat around the rekindled campfire discussing what had happened. Sarah suggested it might have been another camper who got lost and wandered into our site by mistake. Alex thought it could have been a park ranger doing a night patrol. Mike joked that maybe it was Bigfoot, earning him a playful punch from Sarah. As for me, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that came over me when I saw that figure. There was something about its stillness, the way it just stood there without responding, that didn't seem quite right. But I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just a combination of unfamiliar surroundings, shadows, and an overactive imagination. We stayed up talking until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. As the world around us gradually came into focus, we decided to pack up and move to a different campsite. None of us felt comfortable staying in that spot for another night. We spent the morning breaking down our tents and packing up our gear. Before we left, we took another look at the footprints in the daylight. They were still there, clear as ever, a tangible reminder that something strange had occurred during the night. We took some photos of the prints, half-jokingly saying we'd submit them to a cryptozoology website when we got back home. As we were about to leave, a park ranger drove by on his morning rounds. We flagged him down and told him about our experience. He listened patiently, taking notes and asking a few questions. He told us that while it wasn't common, sometimes hikers did get lost and wander into campsites. He also mentioned that there had been a few bear sightings in the area recently, which could explain the large footprints. But he admitted that without more evidence, it was hard to say for sure what had happened. The ranger offered to escort us to a new campsite, an offer we gladly accepted. He led us to a spot closer to one of the main campgrounds, where we felt a bit safer with other campers nearby. We spent the rest of our trip there, hiking during the day and gathering around the campfire at night, always making sure to be back before dark. Despite the unsettling start, the rest of our Yellowstone trip was amazing. We saw geysers erupting, watched herds of elk grazing in meadows, and even spotted a grizzly bear from a safe distance. We hiked through canyons, soaked in hot springs, and marveled at the colorful bacterial mats around the geothermal features. But even as we enjoyed the natural wonders of Yellowstone, that first night stayed with us. We found ourselves looking over our shoulders more often, especially when we were in more secluded areas of the park. Every snapping twig or rustling bush would make us jump. We made sure to always stick together and never wander off alone. On our last night in Yellowstone, we stayed up late, reflecting on our trip. We talked about all the incredible things we'd seen and done, the memories we'd made, but inevitably, the conversation turned back to that first night. We each had our own theories about what had happened, ranging from the mundane to the far-fetched. Sarah stuck to her idea of a lost hiker, pointing out that it made the most sense. After all, people get turned around in the wilderness all the time. Alex had warmed up to his park ranger theory, suggesting that maybe they do silent checks on campsites at night to make sure everyone is following the rules. Mike had mostly dropped the Bigfoot jokes, but he did suggest that maybe it was some kind of wildlife researcher doing a night survey. As for me, I still wasn't sure what to think. Part of me wanted to believe it was something simple and explainable. A lost hiker or a ranger doing their rounds. But another part of me couldn't forget the eerie stillness of that figure, the way it had vanished so completely when I shined my light on it. And those footprints, they had been so large, so distinct. In the end, we agreed that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. We decided to keep the story between ourselves, knowing that others might not believe us or might think we were exaggerating. But we made a pact to return to Yellowstone someday, to camp in that same spot by the Lamar River, and see if we could uncover any more clues about our mysterious nighttime visitor. A few years back, my brother Jake and I decided to take a hiking trip in Shenandoah National Park. We'd both been feeling the need to escape the concrete jungle of Washington, D.C., where we'd been living and working for the past couple of years. The idea of spending a few days surrounded by nature, breathing in fresh mountain air, and challenging ourselves on the trails seemed like the perfect antidote to our busy city lives. We spent weeks planning the trip, poring over trail maps and reading up on the park's history and ecology. We decided on a 2-day hike along the Appalachian Trail, which runs through the heart of Shenandoah. Our plan was to start at the Thornton Gap entrance, hike about 10 miles to the Pass Mountain Hut for our overnight stay, and then continue another 8 miles to our endpoint at Elk Wallow Wayside the next day. As the day of our trip approached, we checked and double-checked our gear. We had our backpacks, sleeping bags, a small tent, just in case the hut was full, plenty of water, trail mix, and freeze-dried meals. We also made sure to pack a first aid kit, flashlights, and extra batteries. Jake, always the more cautious one, insisted on bringing a satellite phone in case of emergencies. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, driving from D.C. to the park entrance. The journey took about 2 hours, and we watched as the urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling hills, and then the more rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains. As we entered the park, the trees were a riot of reds, oranges, and golds. It was peak fall foliage season, and the views were absolutely stunning. After parking our car and doing one last gear check, we set off on the trail. The first few miles were exhilarating. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine. We could hear birds calling in the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The trail was well maintained but challenging, with plenty of ups and downs that got our hearts pumping and our muscles working. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when we first encountered the solo hiker. We were taking a short break, sitting on a fallen log and munching on some trail mix, when we saw him approaching from the direction we were headed. He was a tall, lanky guy, probably in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and long hair pulled back in a ponytail. His gear looked well worn, like he'd been on the trail for a while. As he got closer, we gave him a friendly wave, and he stopped to chat for a bit. He introduced himself as Mike and said he'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for the past month, starting in Maine and working his way south. He asked where we were headed, and we told him about our plans to stay at Pass Mountain Hut. He mentioned he was planning to push on a bit further to the next shelter. Something about Mike seemed a bit off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around, never quite settling on us as we talked. Or perhaps it was the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his backpack straps. Jake later told me he'd noticed it too. A kind of nervous energy that seemed at odds with someone who'd supposedly been on the trail for a month. We chatted for a few more minutes, exchanging the usual hiker small talk about the weather and trail conditions. Mike mentioned that he'd seen a black bear and 2 cubs about a mile back, which put us on high alert. We thanked him for the information and wished him well as he continued on his way. As we resumed our hike, Jake and I discussed our encounter with Mike. We both agreed that something had felt a bit strange, but we couldn't quite agree on what. Jake thought he might be dealing with some kind of anxiety or maybe even withdrawal from something. I wondered if he was just socially awkward or possibly not used to interacting with people after a month on the trail. Either way, we decided to keep our distance if we ran into him again. The rest of the day's hike was uneventful but beautiful. We stopped often to take in the breathtaking vistas from various overlooks along the trail. At one point, we spotted a pair of red-tailed hawks circling overhead, their cries echoing through the valley below. We also came across a small herd of white-tailed deer, who regarded us calmly for a moment before bounding off into the forest. We reached Pass Mountain Hut, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The hut was a simple 3-sided structure with a wooden floor designed to provide shelter for hikers along the Appalachian Trail. There were already a few other hikers there, a retired couple from Florida and a group of college students from Virginia Tech. We all exchanged greetings and set about preparing our evening meals. As we sat around eating our rehydrated camping food, which tasted surprisingly good after a long day of hiking, we swapped stories with our fellow hikers. The retired couple, Bob and Linda, were section hiking the Appalachian Trail, doing a bit each year with the goal of eventually completing the entire trail. The college students were on a long weekend trip, taking a break from their studies to enjoy the outdoors. We mentioned our encounter with Mike, and to our surprise, Bob and Linda said they'd met him too a couple of days back. They described him as seeming agitated and confused, asking them repeatedly about the location of the next town. The college students hadn't seen him, but they promised to keep an eye out. As night fell, we all turned in early, tired from the day's exertions and planning to get an early start the next morning. Jake and I had decided to sleep in our tent, pitched just outside the hut, as we both preferred a bit more privacy. I woke up early the next morning, just as the first light of dawn was starting to filter through the trees. I quietly unzipped the tent, careful not to wake Jake, and stepped outside to take in the morning. The air was crisp and cold, and a light mist hung over the surrounding forest, giving everything a dream-like quality. As I stood there, breathing in the cool morning air and listening to the forest come to life around me, I spotted a figure emerging from the mist on the trail. It took me a moment to recognize him, but as he got closer, I realized it was Mike, the solo hiker we'd met the day before. He looked even worse than when we'd first seen him. His clothes were dirty and disheveled, his hair a tangled mess. He was walking with a noticeable limp, and as he got closer, I could see that his eyes were red and bloodshot, with dark circles underneath them. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he spotted me, he quickened his pace, almost stumbling in his haste to reach me. As he got closer, he He started asking for directions, his voice hoarse and desperate. He claimed he had lost his map and couldn't remember which way the trail went. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be following him. I was taken aback by his appearance and behavior. It was hard to believe this was the same person we'd met just yesterday. I tried to calm him down, offering him some water and suggesting he sit and rest for a bit. But he seemed unable to stay still, pacing back and forth and continuing to ask about the trail and the nearest town. By this point, Jake and some of the other hikers had woken up and come out to see what was going on. Mike's agitation seemed to increase with the presence of more people. He started rambling about how he needed to get to the next town quickly, that someone was after him. When Jake suggested we could call for help using our satellite phone, Mike's eyes went wide with fear, and he adamantly refused, saying no one could know where he was. We tried to convince Mike to stay and rest, to let us help him, but he wouldn't hear of it. After gulping down some water and grabbing a couple of energy bars that Linda offered him, he took off down the trail at a pace that seemed unsustainable given his apparent exhaustion. As we watched him disappear into the mist, we all stood in stunned silence for a moment. Then we began discussing what to do. The retired couple and the college students were planning to head back the way we'd come, while Jake and I were continuing on in the direction Mike had gone. We agreed that whichever group reached a ranger station first would report the encounter and ask them to keep an eye out for Mike. Jake and I packed up our gear quickly and set off. Our original plan of a leisurely morning hike, forgotten in light of the strange encounter. As we hiked, we kept our eyes peeled for any sign of Mike, but the trail remained empty except for us. About an hour into our hike, we heard a sound that made us both stop in our tracks. It was a man's voice, shouting for help. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere off the trail, down a steep, densely wooded slope to our right. Without hesitation, we left the trail and began carefully making our way down the slope, calling out as we went. We searched for what felt like hours, our voices growing hoarse from shouting. We scrambled over fallen logs, pushed through thick underbrush, and even waded through a small, ice-cold stream. But we found no sign of Mike or anyone else. The forest was silent, except for the usual sounds of birds and small animals. Eventually, we had to admit defeat. We were off the trail, potentially lost ourselves, and the sun was climbing higher in the sky. We needed to get back to the trail and continue to our planned endpoint where we could report everything to the park rangers. It took us a while to find our way back to the trail, and by the time we did, we were both exhausted and on edge. The rest of our hike was subdued, the beautiful scenery overshadowed by our worry for Mike and confusion about what had happened. We finally reached Elk Wallow Wayside in the late afternoon, much later than we had originally planned. We immediately sought out a park ranger and reported everything that had happened. The ranger listened intently, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions. He seemed particularly interested in Mike's behavior and appearance. After we finished our report, the ranger informed us that they had received no other reports of a hiker matching Mike's description. In fact, according to their records, there had been no solo hikers registered on our section of the trail for the past week. This information sent a chill down my spine. Who was Mike? Where had he come from and where had he gone? The ranger assured us that they would conduct a thorough search of the area and put out an alert to all stations. He took our contact information and promised to keep us updated on any developments. He also gently suggested that we might have been affected by exhaustion or the altitude, causing us to misinterpret what we'd seen and heard. But Jake and I knew what we had experienced was real. As we drove back to D.C. that evening, we were quiet, each lost in our own thoughts. The trip that was supposed to be a relaxing break from our everyday lives had turned into something we couldn't quite explain or understand. We went over every detail of our encounters with Mike, trying to make sense of it all. Had he been a fugitive, running from the law? But then why hike on a popular trail where he was bound to encounter other people? Was he suffering from some kind of mental health crisis? That might explain his erratic behavior and paranoia. Or was there some other explanation we hadn't even considered? In the days and weeks that followed, Jake and I checked in regularly with the Park Service, hoping for news. But they never found any trace of Mike. No abandoned gear, no signs of a camp, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We scoured online hiking forums and local news sites, looking for any information about missing hikers or strange encounters in Shenandoah National Park. We found a few stories of hikers getting lost and needing rescue, but nothing that matched our experience with Mike. 2 summers ago, my friends and I decided to embark on a camping adventure in Big Sur, California. Our group consisted of myself, my best friend Liam, his girlfriend Sophia, and our mutual friend Elena. We'd been planning this trip for months, all of us eager to escape the hustle and bustle of our lives in San Francisco and immerse ourselves in the stunning natural beauty of the California coast. We set out early on a Friday morning, our car packed to the brim with camping gear, coolers full of food, and enough enthusiasm to power us through the 3-hour drive down the coast. The journey itself was beautiful, with the winding roads of Highway 1 offering breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean on one side and towering cliffs on the other. As we drove, we chatted excitedly about our plans for the weekend. Liam, always the outdoorsman, had mapped out several hiking trails he wanted us to explore. Sophia was looking forward to practicing her photography skills on the dramatic coastal landscapes. Elena, our resident foodie, had planned an impressive menu of camping-friendly gourmet meals. As for me, I was just happy to be away from my computer and the constant ping of work emails. We arrived at our destination, Kirk Creek Campground, in the early afternoon. The campground was perched on a bluff overlooking the ocean, offering panoramic views that immediately took our breath away. We could see for miles along the rugged coastline, waves crashing against the rocks below, and the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching out to the horizon. After checking in with the park ranger, we made our way to our assigned campsite. It was a spacious spot, partially shaded by a grove of coastal oak trees with enough room for our 2 tents and a communal area for cooking and hanging out. We quickly set about setting up camp, working together to pitch the tents, unpack our gear, and organize our supplies. As we were setting up, I noticed another camper arriving at the site next to ours. He was a solitary figure, a man probably in his mid-40s with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He efficiently set up his small tent and organized his gear, all without saying a word or glancing in our direction. I nudged Liam and pointed out our new neighbor, commenting on how unusual it was to see someone camping alone in such a remote area. Liam shrugged, suggesting that maybe the guy just needed some solitude. We both agreed it was a bit odd that he hadn't come over to say hello, as most campers we'd encountered on previous trips had been friendly and sociable. As the afternoon wore on, we settled into our campsite. Elena started preparing dinner, a delicious-smelling campfire chili, while Sophia set up her camera equipment, eager to capture the sunset. Liam and I gathered firewood and got a campfire going, the warmth and flickering light adding to the cozy atmosphere. Throughout all of this, our silent neighbor remained at his campsite, occasionally visible as he moved around, but never venturing over or even making eye contact. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, I saw him sitting at the edge of the bluff, staring out at the ocean. There was something melancholic about his solitary figure silhouetted against the setting sun. We enjoyed our dinner around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing, the concerns of our daily lives feeling far away. As night fell, the stars came out in force, more numerous and brighter than we ever saw in the city. We spent hours stargazing, picking out constellations and marveling at the occasional shooting star. Before turning in for the night, I took one last look over at our neighbor's campsite. His tent was zipped up, a faint glow of a lantern visible from inside. I wondered briefly about his story. What had brought him out here alone? Before crawling into my own tent and drifting off to sleep, lulled by the distant sound of waves crashing on the rocks below. The next morning I woke up early, eager to watch the sunrise over the ocean. As I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air, I noticed something odd. Our neighbor's tent was still there, looking exactly as it had the night before, but there was no sign of movement or life. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was simply a late sleeper or perhaps had gone for an early morning hike. I made my way to the bluff's edge, sat down on a convenient rock, and watched as the sky slowly changed color from deep indigo to soft pinks and oranges, finally bursting into a brilliant gold as the sun peeked over the horizon. As the day brightened, my friends began to stir. We gathered around our campfire pit, boiling water for coffee and planning our day's adventures. Liam wanted to hike the Vicente Flat Trail, known for its challenging terrain and rewarding views. Elena and Sophia were more interested in exploring the tide pools along the beach below our campsite. While we discussed our plans, I found my attention continually drawn to our neighbor's silent campsite. Hours had passed, and there was still no sign of him. His tent remained zipped up, his car hadn't moved, and the campsite looked undisturbed. I mentioned my observations to the others. At first they didn't seem too concerned. Liam suggested that maybe the guy had gone for a long hike or drive. Sophia wondered if he might be unwell and sleeping it off. But as the morning wore on and there was still no sign of life from the neighboring campsite, we all began to feel uneasy. Around midday, we decided to approach the tent. We called out, asking if everything was okay, but received no response. After a brief discussion, we decided to unzip the tent, worried that our neighbor might be in distress. What we found only deepened the mystery. The tent was empty, but all of the man's belongings were still there. His sleeping bag was unrolled, a book lay open on top of it, and a half-empty water bottle sat in one corner. It looked as though he had just stepped out and might return at any moment. We stood there, exchanging worried glances, unsure of what to do next. Elena suggested we check the area around the campsite, thinking he might have taken a fall or gotten lost nearby. We spent the next hour combing the immediate area, calling out and searching behind rocks and in the nearby brush, but found no trace of the man. As the afternoon progressed, our concern grew. We decided to report the situation to the park rangers. Liam and I hiked to the ranger station, while Sophia and Elena stayed behind to keep an eye on things. The rangers took our report seriously, asking detailed questions about when we'd last seen the man and what we'd observed. They promised to send out a search party and asked us to return to our campsite and wait for further instructions. The rest of the day passed in a haze of worry and speculation. Our planned activities were forgotten as we waited anxiously for news. Park rangers came and went, examining the empty tent and the surrounding area. They asked us more questions, jotting down notes and speaking in low, serious tones. As evening approached, there was still no sign of our missing neighbor. The Rangers informed us that they were expanding the search area and bringing in additional resources, including a helicopter for an aerial survey of the rugged terrain. That night, none of us slept well. The empty tent next to ours seemed to loom in the darkness, a silent reminder of the man who had vanished without a trace. We talked late into the night, coming up with theories and scenarios, each one seeming less likely than the last. Had he gone for a hike and gotten lost? But surely an experienced camper would have taken basic supplies, none of which were missing from his tent. Had he decided to leave in the middle of the night? But his car was still there, and all his belongings remained untouched. The more we talked, the more confused and unsettled we became. The next morning brought no answers. The search continued, with teams of rangers and volunteers combing the area. We were asked to stay at our campsite in case the man returned or in case the rangers needed to ask us more questions. As the day wore on, our initial shock and worry began to mix with a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. We wanted to help with the search, but the rangers insisted it was best for us to stay put. We found ourselves constantly scanning the horizon, hoping to see a lone figure making his way back to camp. By late afternoon, the rangers called off the ground search, citing the dangerous terrain and lack of any promising leads. They assured us that they would continue to investigate, checking traffic cameras on nearby roads and reaching out to local hospitals and shelters. We were faced with a difficult decision. Our planned departure was the next morning, but we felt uncomfortable leaving with the situation unresolved. After much discussion, we decided to stick to our original plan. The Rangers took our contact information and promised to keep us updated on any developments. As we packed up our gear the next morning, I couldn't help but glance repeatedly at the other tent, still standing empty and undisturbed. It felt wrong somehow to leave it there, a lonely testament to the man who had vanished. But the Rangers had been clear. Everything needed to be left as it was for their investigation. In the weeks that followed, we checked in regularly with the Park Service, hoping for news. But as time passed, it became clear that the man's disappearance would likely remain unsolved. No body was found, no clues emerged, and eventually the case went cold. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.